In this house, we believe Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights. No human is illegal. Science is real. Love is love.
You realise this is not a relativist culture at all. And so although at the heart of Western culture at the moment, there is still a post-truth problem, which is we are affirming Christian things based on premises that don't support them at all because they're materialist in nature. Nevertheless, the tenor of our culture is still one that believes certain things are true and you must live by them. And if you don't, you are a heretic. And language like that might even be used. You do need to repent. You do need to be awakened and all these sorts of things. It's very religious language.
Hello and welcome to Post-Christianity. My name is Glen Scrivener.
And I'm Andrew Wilson.
And together we're thinking about our cultural moment in historical perspective and thinking about the ways in which our culture is Christian and post-Christian and maybe even pre-Christian. We'll see if we get there later in the episode. Let me read a quote to you. This will be familiar to a lot of people, and if you're in the United States, maybe you have seen this driving around. It's a yard sign. And it says, "In this house, we believe Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights. No human is illegal. Science is real. Love is love. Kindness is everything." And it's an incredibly faith-filled statement, isn't it? It's creedal.
Literally creedal, as in this house we believe. There's obviously a creed of its own. Yeah.
Yes. And in a sense, this whole podcast is kind of an answer to this question. But in terms of... But can you
explain where that comes from?
In 45 seconds. Yeah. So things like, kindness is everything. Let's take that one.
Yeah.
Kindness is king. #be kind. It's often noted that some of the most censorious...
Yes, the people most likely to use the hashtag are the people most likely to want to read it.
Some of the cruelest people use the hashtag be kind. And I think that's interesting as a symbol of how Christianized we've become. Not that those virtues have necessarily embedded themselves in our hearts, but they are certainly the slogans that we can use that will gain instant assent. We ought to be kind, oughtn't we? And yet, I guess for an ancient person, that's up for debate, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think there's a lot of ancient people, as we'll probably touch on in other episodes, would have completely rejected a whole bunch of those things. The idea that compassion or humility or things like that are virtues would be, not just... up for debate. It'd be like, it's not up for debate. It clearly is not a virtue. Kindness probably a little more, but the centrality of something like love in the way it plays the role in the biblical story and the fruit of the Spirit, kindness, goodness, being long-suffering, the first one being love, self-control, those sorts of things. In many ways, the only ones that you would have assumed would be on the list of the fruit of the Spirit for an ancient pagan would be something like self-control. And
temperance.
Even then, they'd mean something quite different from what Paul meant by it.
Yes.
So it's remarkable how those things are they're conversation stoppers now.
Yes.
But very, very contingent on the influence that Christianity's had.
And that's a really interesting comparison. So the four Stoic virtues, which sort of Aristotle would have taught as well as Plato in terms of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance would be those four, which they belong really in the military barracks. You can think of that on a poster telling the soldiers to be more virile, because the word virtue is taken from the Latin word for vir, man, right? Yeah. It's manliness. It's quite militaristic. Whereas you just quoted the fruit of the Spirit, and love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. This sounds like it belongs in the family home.
Yes.
We've gone from the military barracks to the family home. And Larry Hurtado does a great job in lots of books, including The Destroyer of the Gods, of showing how love was right at the heart of the early church's ethic. And that was blowing people away in the centrality that love has had. Now it's just a Beatles song. And now it's just, love, love, love. Yeah. Is everywhere. So how have we gone from there to there?
It's a beautiful irony, because of course the Beatles were the ones who said, we're bigger than Jesus now, but actually of course the songs they sang, so they're often seen, at least in the context of the early 60s. I think people in the early 60s complaining about the Beatles would not have enjoyed returning in 2022 or 2023. But at the time, they were seen as the sort of almost anti-Christian, certainly in North America, by the church. But actually, they are just the most obvious poster boys for how embedded Christian ideals had become, that you could sing love, 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 love is all you need. And everyone would go, well, obviously that's the summer of love, all that stuff. Now, obviously they're putting new meaning into it, but the idea that value was not up for debate and you could say it as a truism and everyone would accept it, goes right back to Paul and before, even back to the love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself being the summary of the law. So very, very old and Judeo-Christian ideas that have just become normalized to the point that people don't think they're making a theological statement at all. They're simply stating the obvious. But as you say, if you read Homer, you don't get that impression at all. Achilles is not pacing around after Patroclus, and just sort of thinking, oh yeah, well this is, love is all you need. I should just basically forgive my enemies. That's not the dynamic in the story would collapse if that was what the Odyssey was about or the Aeneid. That's just not the way they work. So it is a powerful testimony. How that happened, of course, we're going to say in a large part is due to the influence of Christianity in all sorts of ways. And we could talk a bit more some of the specifics. But yeah, over time, more and more explicitly Christian virtues seep into the culture to the point that those virtues eventually become reasons to object to Christianity,
right?
Which is where we are now. And that's what's fascinating, that when people complain about Christianity now, they don't complain for the same reasons as they did in the ancient world. In the ancient world, this is insufficiently virile. This is for stupid people. This is for women and slaves, is how they would... Celsus would say, that's what the reason Christianity is obviously for fools is look at all these women and slaves who come. Whereas now you'd say, even though it's it's dramatically more inclusive of, you might say women and formerly enslaved people than the ancient view. Now people would attack it for being oppressive against women and slaves rather than too inclusive of them. And so it's a fascinating transition. And the reasons why people object to Christianity now are themselves Christian reasons,
right?
Because love is all you need, and love has only been slightly tweaked in order to mean you need to accept everything everyone does, and effectively the critique of Christianity is a Christian one. Which is a weird.
Wow, we're all throwing Bible verses at each other. We've just forgotten the references, and that's the sort of, this is the house that Jesus built. This house that believes these things is inconceivable without the house that Jesus built.
Yes.
So going back to Celsus, his great critique of Christians, so writing in the 2nd century, was that it was a religion for women, slaves, and children. He identified the chief error of both Jews and Christians was that it was insufficiently. It was far too anthropocentric, far too man-centered. It is not obvious that the gods would put their affections on man over and above the celestial bodies and all the other gods, and why is humanity so front and center? That in Judaism, man would be in God's image, and in Christianity, God would become man. This is a disgustingly humanistic kind of religion, and that's what struck the ancient world, is how humanistic. And again, nowadays we think, humanism is like the enemy of Christianity, is the alternative. I think a Celsus might see things a bit more clearly. Yeah. That actually, again, humanism is utterly inconceivable without the Jesus revolution.
Because a God takes flesh, and there's no higher way of validating a God, the God.
Yes.
But from a pagan's perspective, your God has taken flesh and has given the biggest possible validation tick to human nature and flesh and matter and physical stuff, as we touched on in the previous episode, but not just physical stuff, but the form of humanity and the idea of being a creature with an upright spine and opposable thumbs and a large cranium, all that's just been given the biggest sign-off you could possibly be given by God.
Yes.
By both, God has made man in his image, but also God has then taken on that image, and in a sense that then the values that flow from it, they love your neighbor as yourself, is you don't just love your neighbor because God tells you to. You love your neighbor because they themselves have a dignity and a value that wouldn't be seen as belonging to human beings in another belief system. And that in part is just because God himself has taken flesh and said, as James says, with our mouth, we praise our God and Father, and then we curse humans who are made in God's likeness. Brothers, this shan't be. Yes. And you think, that's because human beings bearing God's image is so radical that it now, again, taken for granted, in a sense, even by people who don't believe in God, that there is something uniquely dignified about a human being.
Yes.
But that idea is just the very, very long after echoes of Judeo-Christianity becoming normalized in our culture.
Yes, and the stark juxtaposition of a naturalistic account of the world that says, man has descended from apes.
Yes.
therefore we must love one another, which, who's the philosopher who's...
Vladimir Solovyov. Exactly how to pronounce it, I don't know, but that's, and it's just a remarkable... the non sequitur at the heart of the West is basically, you believe man is descended from apes, therefore love one another. You think, that conclusion clearly doesn't follow from that premise.
Yes.
But they're also fervently held, and of course the reason why they can both be held at the same time is because Christianity gives us this belief, and has just gradually been eroded from the discourse. But it's so widely assumed, you can continue to function as if everyone knows it.
Yes.
Even though you don't actually have the rational foundations for it anymore.
Yeah, so in the 7 values that I explore in The Air We Breathe, equality, no human being is the inferior of any other, no matter what their race, religion, sexuality is. We are all equal. We all believe that. Compassion, that a society is best that treats its weakest members the best, and that's how it should be judged. We all take that for granted. Consent. Elite males do not have the right to access others. Consent must be central to sexual relationships. Enlightenment. Education is a good, and we must further our ends by persuasion and not by force. Science, we believe that science can be done and that it is good to be done. Freedom, no human is the property of another human. And progress, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But I often do with people, like that sounds like humanism, doesn't it? Like those beliefs sound like humanism. And people just sort of say, well, look, we don't need Christianity for that. We've got secular humanism. And I always want to pull apart those two words. Well, the secular, the non-religious view is that we are the product of blind evolutionary forces, and we're all equal to one another. It is a brutal, survival of the fittest. Yeah. And we should be kind to one another. You and me, baby, we ain't nothing but mammals. Yeah. So let's honor one another's sexual boundaries at all times. Yeah. And you think secular humanist, pick one. And I've got 2 arguments at that stage. One is historically that great humanism that you believe in did not come from here historically. Yeah. But then the more philosophical argument is, and that great humanism could not have can't be grounded by it. Come from there. And I think Christian Smith does a great job on Atheist Overreach on the could not. And I think someone like a Tom Holland does a great job on the historical did not. Yes. But I think we really need to be pulling apart secular and humanism in people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, sorry to always try and bring it back to 1776, but I think a figure who is probably well known, at least in outline, but very few people have read, partly because his writings are just so horribly offensive, is the Marquis de Sade. And he is an extraordinary, he'd be well known, sadist, So we all know that this is obviously a very, very bad man. Financially incontinent, grotesquely fat, flogs widows and pours hot wax into their wounds and has a sort of sexual turn on and rapes multiple people, starts a relationship with a teenage child when he's 70. I mean, he's just a vile, vile man who obviously talked about the need for how it celebrated the role of pain and violence and, what we now call sadism and cruelty. And celebrated it. But it's fascinating because there is a strong theological or anti-theological underpinning to his project, which is essentially, if you don't believe, he's so angry, he hates the Christian God so much that he wants to get rid of not just the Christian God, but the Christian morality that flows from it. And you could say, well, the man's a loon. And of course, in many ways, he is, and a very odious one. But actually what he's doing is quite intellectually consistent, because what he's saying is that if you get rid of God, the alternative God you have to hold up is nature. And if you look at nature and how nature functions, it is characterized by, the strong eating the weak and the survival of the most, when you say the survival of the fittest, that's to make it sound like a gym rat. It's actually the survival of the most, the violent.
Adaptable.
Yeah, well, the most efficaciously violent, or the one.
Right.
Do you see what I mean? That's
Forceful,
how, and in a sense, we're here because somewhere in the distant past, our ancestors survived in a fight for resources with other people's ancestors, and if you're a thoroughgoing evolutionist, you go back into other animal species, the same is true. And so Sade is, as much as it's just. Honestly, is literally diabolical to read. And I've deliberately avoided reading too much for my soul, but read enough to see that the moral consistency, strangely, in a horrible way, of what he's doing, which is to say, if you get rid of the Christian God, the only other way of effectively establishing morality would be just to look at nature, the way the world actually is, And you would end up, you might end up with the Homer version we were mentioning, or you might end up with a more vigorously violent and unpleasant one. But in the end, your moral framework would have to be formed by the way that the world truly is, rather than in nature, red in tooth and claw, rather than by the Christian values we've inherited. Nietzsche does the same 100 years later. And I think that in some ways they are making the point that this could not have come from, not just that this did not come from Christianity, it couldn't have. Because what other foundation do you have other than the way the world actually is to establish a moral framework? So as much as I don't recommend anyone read Sade, I think he is making a compelling version of the argument you're making from the opposite side.
Yes. Some would come back and they would say, what was that very popular book, Non-Zero, saying that, evolution involves cooperation.
Yeah.
And they would make certain arguments about, we could only get so far if we did not cooperate. Families, clans, tribes. I think the pushback on that, and Christian Smith does a good job on this, is to say, yes, they cooperate. They cooperate in order to compete.
Yes.
And that is the driver. You need the differential between two different species in order for the one to have the advantage, and for that advantage
you're not
to be
benevolent towards all human beings. You're benevolent to the human beings with whom you are collaborating in order to establish some degree of tribal advantage over and against other human beings.
Right.
Which may or may not be right, but that's but you're not. It's not sort of UN, humanitarian intervention type. That does not grow in sort of evolutionary soil. It's grown in Christian soil and then been transposed into an evolutionary narrative.
Yeah, I often tell the story of the Good Samaritan and imagine different tellings of it. Whether I'm a kind of a if it was an Aesop's fable, for instance, once upon a time there was a guy, he was out late at night where he shouldn't have been. He got beaten up, idiot.
Yes.
Don't be like that guy. That's all the Aesop's fables. It's kind of know your place, live wisely within your limits. Don't get ahead of yourself. That's kind of Aesop's fable, and that's kind of Greco-Roman wisdom. And I think the Stoics at the best are kind of in a different era, but they are kind of living wisely within their means, and don't be an idiot about it, but keep to yourself. And then Jesus tells the actual story in which he gets beaten up, and then the priest and the Levite walk on by. And I think there is a certain tranche of Old Testament believer who thinks, well, no harm, no foul.
Yeah.
Right? They were sticking to their Levitical laws.
He's not in the ditch because of me.
So how is he on me? And how do I know if I'm intervening in this situation? Am I intervening against what God wants? Maybe, on a classical understanding, the gods want him there. Maybe the village wants him there. Who am I to...
Inshallah.
Yeah, exactly. So a Muslim understanding absolutely would walk on by, and not only would they walk on by, they would not know what was wrong with walking on by. And now we all know what's wrong with walking on by because the Good Samaritan has so thoroughly shaped us, because here is an intervention, and it's taking nature and it's doing something about nature. It's a supernatural thing, isn't it, for the Good Samaritan to come and raise up the man, a certain man, Adam, let's say, but to raise up Adam from his natural state and to save him and heal him in this way is a real interventionist, supernatural kind of value. And yet we all take it for granted nowadays, to the point where I gave a sermon on this last year in Cardiff, and a friend drove me to the church. And I began the sermon by saying, on the way to church, we passed underneath this underpass, and I looked up and there was a guy in great distress, and he had one leg on one side of the barrier and another leg on the other side of the barrier, and it looked like he was going to jump. And we drove on. You could have heard a pin drop. It was just like, you did what? You drove on? So well, there was an ambulance member up there. There were two police guys there. Like, the Good Samaritan had already shown up.
Yeah.
But we rely, exactly. Like, you walked on by? How could you? And yet that kind of, it's a supernatural value we now have that we've inherited from the Jesus Revolution that we now sort of take for granted. And we can't even think ourselves into the sandal of the priest or the Levite.
Yeah.
Or any priest or Levite affirming person. Yeah. Like, how could you?
Or at best, we might say, I have been the priest or the Levite, but I realize I shouldn't have, and I felt bad about it.
Yes. Yeah. And I would confess that in the Augustinian sense, and be in touch with that internal struggle that I have, and so we just live in a thoroughly different world, and we've been shaped by this Good Samaritan. And some people nowadays I guess on the right of politics would say, well, personal charity can do the job of and the more libertarians would say, okay, individual charity can take care of the guy by the side of the road, and that's our Good Samaritan. And some would say, well, welfare programs, but nobody walks on by anymore. It's utterly taken for granted.
Either the state's got to do it, or an NGO's got to do it, or you have. But yes, it has to be done.
Yeah. To the point where bringing up the Marquis de Sade or Nietzsche is really important, I think, at times, for just saying, well, why not? I mean, Nietzsche absolutely nailed that the cross was the transvaluation of all values, in which, well, of course, it's, in a world of survival of the fittest and the sacrifice of the weakest, the most egregious upending of what is natural would be the fittest sacrificed for we the weakest, so that we the weakest might survive, and not only survive but thrive and pass on the compassion revolution. He absolutely identified what is at the heart of our culture, what is at the heart of our moral presuppositions.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, when I've been in conversation with Tom Holland, the historian, he speaks in those terms, and he mentions about the Marquis de Sade, he mentions about Nietzsche. And, I've said to him in the past, it is, you sound like you're saying, Tom, it's either Christ or the pit, right? It's Christ or this diabolical thing. And he sort of has said, well, yes, but, the path of Western culture has been to try to navigate a third way, to try to just be a good chap, in the midst of that stark choice. But I think that middle ground kind of evaporates the more you look at it, and the more you look at the stark choice, because on what grounds are you going to do the compassion thing? Where is that foundation if it's not going to be Christ? I don't know where it is.
Yeah. And one of the things one of the ways I like thinking, to go back to our yard sign for a moment, it's not just the things that are on the belief statements, all of which are, of course, grown out of Christian soil, and in many ways taken at least as they stand. I know they would connote some things that I wouldn't agree with in terms of what public policy ought to be on a particular area, but when it comes to the statements as they stand, you'd say that all of those things are true, and all of those things grow from Christian foundations. I know they're being used to often refer to other things, but as they stand, they're true and they're Christian. But it's not just the statements themselves; it's the form of the statements. It's the fact that in this house we believe. And I know we joke about the idea of that being a secular creed, but you think even the fact that you can do that, you say, I'm identifying myself by affirmations I make, by things I believe,
right?
And it is obviously modelled on the Nicene or the Apostles' Creed. But what defines me is a set of it's not just love, it's also faith. It's also statement, I affirm this thing, I believe that. You actually can't see my life necessarily and tell me my yard, it's in my yard, it's not in the next door neighbours. They might be a much nicer person than me. They might be much nicer to women or minorities or whoever than I am. But I believe these things. And obviously social media has massively exacerbated that trend, because what I say I believe is the only thing you can measure. You can't measure what I'm actually doing. And so again, that idea not just of the primacy of love, but the centrality of faith within the context of a worldview is itself a very Christian thing, and particularly a very Protestant thing. I talk a bit in the book about the idea that we are, in the end, the West is made up of Protestant pagans.
Yes.
Because we're people with very strong Protestant-like convictions that really takes its cue not just in substance but in form from Protestantism.
Yes.
But mingled in with actually a pagan, more like Marquis de Sade vision of the way reality actually is.
Right.
And the fusion has made us, very unstable, I guess, morally and theologically. And I think there's plenty of scope to press into that with people as we discuss with them. Well, hang on, this part of you, in a way, your vision of reality is very pagan. You only believe in one kind of reality rather than two. There is matter. There is not God and spirit, or at least that's what you say you believe.
Right.
But at the same time, you've got these very transcendent moral absolute views, which are taken in the form of a creed, put a high emphasis on faith, high emphasis on love, are drawn from grace rather than nature. But you've brought the two together in a sort of slightly strange thing that I have come to call Protestant paganism, as a way of trying to capture how odd it is, and yet how widespread it is.
Yes. And so what we have nowadays is sort of discernibly Christian-ish, but distorted in significant ways. So I often talk about, equality in a biblical sense means we're all welcome at the same table. We all have a seat to share in the same meal.
Yeah.
I think nowadays it has become a kind of an individualism where equality means we all are meant to be equally high up the same individual ladder. Or compassion has kind of been detached from the Christian story and distorted a little bit to the point where instead of go and do likewise, be the Good Samaritan, is let's beat the guy by the side of the road, and competitive victimhood is a thing, you know. And then consent, Christianity injected consent right to the heart of the sexual relationship, and praise God for that. But now it's almost as if there's nothing else now except consent in the sexual realm. And then you sort of weave those things back together again, and you've got individualism, you've got competitive victimhood, and you've got choice being the thing in the sexual realm. And so, doesn't that help to explain gender ideology and all that kind of stuff? And we might think that is incredibly anti-Christian. And I can see, yes, to follow through some of these arguments to their conclusions, you end up in a place that is diametrically opposed to Genesis chapter 1. And yet you can see how they got there.
Yeah.
Because there is a place for the individual, and there is a place for victims and minorities, and protecting them, being compassionate towards them, is there not? And it's a profoundly Christianized argument.
Yes.
Even on the other side of the ideological aisle to you, you're dealing with someone who has profoundly Christian-ish views.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to kind of be aware of.
Yes, it absolutely is. And it's fascinating the extent to which even the inconsistency of taking those values and using them as a means to attack what Christianity is and purports to be is often not seen. Partly because I think it's Christianity, as we've said before, has been so successful at baking the ideas into Western culture that people don't think of them as Christian anymore. They think of them as self-evident. Back to the word from a couple of episodes back. But I think then the reality is that often what's happening is you are, whether in a private conversation or in the public square, you're engaging with debate with somebody who is using a Christian argument to object to your Christian belief.
Right.
And I personally, I see that as an opportunity rather than as obviously it's strange, but its very strangeness is a point in our favor in that sense, because I think, I'd rather be arguing with that person than I would be with the Marquis de Sade. Because I think he's got it's awful, but there's a grim consistency to that view, or even with Nietzsche, who is a brilliant opponent of Christianity because he knows exactly what Christianity is, and he's understood it much better than a lot of modern critics of Christianity would, and he's seen how radically different from what he believes it is, and is prepared to tackle it for what it is. And I'd rather be debating with someone who's effectively holding a Christian view and hitting me over the head with it than I would with somebody who has consistently rejected everything that it stands for, because I just don't really know where to start. So I think that evangelistically there's a lot of opportunity. I'm as a preacher, I spend a lot of time thinking, how do I help make Christianity comprehensible to a contemporary person? I think the amount of common ground you have because of the influence of this worldview in your society is massive, and it's just a great opportunity to be able to say, I actually buy much of what you're doing when you're yelling at me for this. Much of it I agree with. The church has done this, and this, and that's bad. And I affirm it, and I say the only thing I'd add is the critique you're making is grown out of ultimately who Jesus is grown out of the incarnation and the dignity of humanity. It's grown out of the cross and the inversion of the powers of the world, grown out of the resurrection and the hope of a new world. It's Christian creedal in its shape, even as the content has been filled with other things. So I'm quite a fan in that sense. And I think even on some of the most hot button issues imaginable, we've mentioned gender. Let's mention abortion. So here is something that, I mean, the early church absolutely pioneered looking after the discarded infants that were cast off. The very first manual of midwifery in the first century, chapter 1 of this manual of midwifery, on how to discern the offspring that are worth raising. Because if not, then we know what happened to them, and they would put them on rubbish dumps or throw them down wells and that kind of thing. And Christians eventually started to collect them, and the orphan care and all this kind of stuff. And so the pro-life instincts of Jews and Christians were always weird to the classical world. And, Tacitus even remarks on there's this one Germanic tribe, and they don't actually practice infanticide. Isn't that weird? That's what struck him. But then suddenly Jews and Christians have this incredible pro-life kind of mindset and practice, and they back it up with costly womb to tomb kind of care.
What's interesting nowadays, because one of the objections to the thesis that we've become Christianized is, well, we'll have a look. Have you seen how many abortions are happening? Like 1 million a week in the world. Have we really become so Christianized? And lamentably, I think our Christianization has not changed our behaviors on this so much, but it has certainly changed our rhetoric and our justifications around it. Because on the pro-choice side, I just mentioned choice, right?
Yeah.
Okay, consent, right at the heart of female autonomy, the bodily integrity of women and the full equality of women. Abortion is healthcare. What a profoundly Christian thing, healthcare. And so even with something that I think is antithetical to biblical Christianity, it can't get away
without Christian premises,
without being clothed in some kind of Christian. It's a very thin clothing, and you can press beneath it. But then that tactic of, in those sorts of conversations, being able to say, I see you want to stand up for the weak and the marginalized, don't you? So do we. So on that pro-choice side, you like, what about the women? And you're like, absolutely, I affirm that. Let me stand with you, shoulder to shoulder, in your desire to look out for the little guy. But let's be honest, there is another little guy here. And I think that's one example of how affirming and understanding the Christian-ish kind of values that people have really help you rhetorically to stand shoulder to shoulder with them, to look at and to look at a common enemy, and then to look at your feet and say, now what are we standing on here? And it's the thoroughly Christian thing.
Yeah, it is. No, I think an opportunity. It's not an easy one always to navigate, because sometimes people are so, as I say, the norms are so baked in that people don't think of it as a problem. They take it as a given. So when you say that, you've got that from Christianity, a lot of people's response at that point is, or you have to do a lot of church. Yeah, exactly. I've never been to, well, they might deny it and say, I'm not Christian at all. Yeah. But if you were to start telling some of the story that we're telling in these conversations, they even then might go, well, a lot of people do. I don't really care. It doesn't matter where it comes from. We've now moved beyond that. And the analogy I've sometimes used is the idea that we are post-Christian in the same sense that we are post-industrial. So people talk sometimes about a post-industrial area regeneration or something in a city. And in fact, you may have been there. We were together in New York last week, and you had this sort of area here, which is almost like a post-industrial, the High Line, this sort of idea of like an urban garden, that kind of thing. And of course, post-industrial environments are post-industrial because they are able to build on and benefit from the legacy of the Industrial Revolution, and then say, because we've got all of this power and all of this metal and all of this machinery, we are able now to move beyond it and make certain lifestyle choices, like installing a wood burner or going vegan, or because I'm not worried I'm going to run out of calories. I'm not worried I'm going to run out of heat. I'm not worried that there's going to be nowhere to live. Because I've got industrialization, I can move beyond it and dabble in other things. And I think that's how the modern world relates to Christianity. We are post-Christian in that sense. We say, because Christianity has done all this for me, I can now say, I will have some pagan spirituality. I'm going to get this kind of prayer wheel. I'm going to think about the spiritual in this way, or in no way at all, because I'm not worried that my morality will suddenly end up with the Marquis de Sades.
Yes.
Or I think Game of Thrones is a good illustration of it, isn't it? Game of Thrones is kind of the way morality, what Lord of the Rings would look like if there was no Christianity in it.
Yes.
And you think, but I'm not worried that Western morality is suddenly going to turn up in Westeros.
Right.
Or Assad or Nietzsche or the Roman Colosseum ripping people to pieces for public pleasure.
Yes.
And because I'm not worried about that, I feel like I can build on the legacy of Christianity and move on.
Yes.
And I think that means that people often don't initially see the problem.
Yes.
But of course, I do think there is a question, what would happen if the Christian capital ran out? Is that a thing? We haven't been in this post-Christian environment long enough to know what happens when it runs out, or if it runs out.
Yes.
But I think sometimes showing people that heritage, I think it's apologetically compelling and intellectually persuasive, but some people will just go, I don't really care. And I think that sometimes there can be hard work in almost, I know it's language you use a lot, about joining the dots to help them see what it is about Christianity that they actually need to be able to sustain that. And on what basis does this other, maybe fringe group in Western society, but they're going there.
Yes.
On what basis are you going to say that's wrong? And Would it worry you if they did? And you can see flickers of that in the last 5 years in even political movements in the West, which is unnerving enough. So that was a long comment, but I think it's a double observation that there is sometimes a challenge with showing people why it's a problem. But I think the effort still needs to be made, because otherwise people will assume, like industrialization, that's past. Now it's a new thing. I think you can only do that thing if you've still got this thing.
So to say we're in a post-Christian moment does not mean that Christianity is entirely in the rearview mirror and we're in a different kind of unrelated moment, because it's not unrelated at all. It's entirely continuous with the Jesus revolution that has, got us to where we've gotten to. So I was thinking yesterday about, whether post-rock was an analogy. The danger with this analogy is that nobody knows what post-rock is.
You have to explain to me what post-rock is.
It's like this thing that you've never heard of. But you probably have heard Sigur Rós, or you've heard This May Destroy You.
Yes, the Planet Earth people.
Yeah, and as soon as you hear it, you'll understand, okay, it's a lot of guitars, and there's drums, and with Sigur Rós, this kind of nonsense lyrics over the top, and they've broken down the verse, chorus structure. But it's rock. But it's post-rock. And what I like about sort of thinking about post-Christianity in that sense is that post-rock is a fad, actually. Right. And rock, I think, will be a lot more enduring than post-rock has been. I think post-rock is a kind of an offshoot of this bigger, more enduring thing. And I think that's what we've got with Christianity. And the other thing, you talked about sort of joining the dots. I often think in evangelism, what we're trying to do is, when we show people compassion, when we show people that Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, science is real, love is love, kindness is everything, we're showing them the imprint of the asteroid that has fallen, in our world, and it's a very Jesus-y imprint that they're kind of responding to. And when they see compassion enacted, and hopefully they see compassion enacted in us, so that we don't just talk a pro-life game, but what does it look like to actually look after the least, the last, and the lost in our communities, and to live these embodied lives, and they see compassion lived out and fleshed. They're starting to see Jesus in a really concrete sort of a sense, and I think that becomes very attractive when the alternative is this house believes, and it becomes a shouting match. And I think post-Christian society has become everything they accused Christians of being. This very pharisaical, without God everything is not permitted. Without God everything is very preachy all of a sudden. And so I think there's a real opportunity as well to wean people off the pure dogma of I believe this is my virtue signal, to here is a Christ-like, way of life that's embodied, that's rich, that is compassion incarnate. And as soon as you start talking about compassion incarnate, you're on the way to Jesus.
That's fascinating, isn't it? Because I think, I'm just processing this idea for the first time, but I think when I was at 20 years ago, university, young adult, whatever, starting to work, I still heard a lot of talk, whether or not it was actually the reality, I don't know, but a lot of talk as if relativism was the defining spirit of the age. As if actually all beliefs are equally. And I think there was some of that, but I must admit that my encounters with friends, obviously many, almost all my friends at university were not Christians, and in my first jobs, that I don't think I encountered very much of that sort of relativism in anything like a meaningful. I mean, there'd be people who'd say, "Oh, I'm glad for you," but what they really mean is, "You carry on believing that. If it works for you, it doesn't work for me." But they didn't mean there is no such thing as truth. That wasn't people didn't. I think there was a spasm of that, perhaps, but it quickly subsided to be replaced by more like what you've called preachy, and what I'm calling Protestant paganism. It's like it is declarative. It's assertive. It's morally confident and grounded, and in a sense of certainty and progress and conviction, and actually it's quite absolutist. And it's just interesting that you quite often get this where the church will respond to a couple of fairly outlandish claims, even post-truth. There's a bit like that. So, of course, everyone's going post-truth. You think they aren't really. What they're saying is they're moving past the trust of institutions. Perhaps the respected arbiters in a society are changing from legacy media to whatever, or from politics. So that's clearly happening. Yeah. But the idea that people say, no, we don't believe anything's true, You just have to look at the yard sign again, or even anyone who would resonate with any of the statements in the yard sign.
Right.
And the reaction you'd get if you stood even in my hairdresser and said, I don't believe in one of those claims. You realize this is not a relativist culture at all. And so although at the heart of Western culture at the moment, there is still a post-truth problem, which is we are affirming Christian things based on premises that don't support them at all because they're materialist in nature. Nevertheless, the tenor of our culture is still one that believes certain things are true, and you must live by them. And if you don't, you are a heretic. And language like that might even be used. That you do need to repent. You do need to be awakened, and all these sorts of things. It's very religious language, as many have pointed out. And I think it shows, relativism, to the extent it happened at all, it was a very short-lived phenomenon, and we are really dealing with a much more strident and morally certain worldview.
Yes, but those certainties have shifted, and we'll get into this in future episodes, I think, in that what the certainties were in Luke chapter 10 and the Good Samaritan, the certainties were, there's Leviticus and there's what priests and Levites ought to do, and that was the certainty. And then there's this weird compassion thing as this supernatural grace that happens. Now what's interesting is nobody believes in the Levitical thing anymore. But we're all very certain that if you walk on by, you're a monster, right? And so what have become the certainties are all the things that are not provable by nature. Like compassion has become a certainty. How did that happen? The idea that there's progress to history has become a certainty. Well, what test tube did you see that in? What laboratory conditions sort of gave you that? All the things we've now become certain of are graces that are echoes of the Christian Revolution, whereas what we're not certain about is nature, biology, and all the rest of it. So
nature and grace have switched places.
Nature and grace have switched places, but we're equally certain. Just certain of the nature thing. All wine, no wineskins. That's
and we were both. It was such a good story, but I thought it was points so well made. Maybe we're going to finish soon, but that we were in a meeting just last week where somebody was making the point. It was such a powerful illustration. Said, so when a Christian is being hit over the head with the stick of tolerance and diversity and inclusion, they can, while carrying on to the blows, at least say to the person hitting them, wait a second, that's my stick. Because the stick itself, the things with which Christianity is being confronted are themselves things that come, as you say, from grace, not from nature. And that may or may not stop the person hitting you with them. It probably doesn't.
No.
But actually there can be something reassuring to understanding that's the cultural dynamic in play here. And often people do come to a place of realizing there is even if all that happens is the person concedes, there is a disconnect between my metaphysical, what I claim I believe about nature, and the values I claim to hold. Even if all I do, I might say I don't care, but I've often said to people, even if people get to the point of seeing there is an inconsistency there, that is progress. That's an achievement, because it's just taking a brick out of a wall. It's destabilizing the convenient resolution that people feel like they have of Christian fruit without Christian roots.
Right.
And being able to say these two things don't go together as well as you think they do, and that is itself worth doing.
Right. And we will press into some of the tactics that we can use in one-to-one and perhaps in preaching and that sort of thing in future episodes. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andrew, and we'll see you again soon.